"Daddy, they said I should wear long sleeves so I don't scare the other kids," my 8-year-old daughter Emma whispered as she held my hand in the school parking lot. Her burn scars glistened in the afternoon sun, marks that told the story of her survival of a fire that nearly destroyed us 5 years ago. I felt my jaw clench when I saw Tyler Morrison running toward us, that cruel smile I recognized from afar. "Hey, freak!" he yelled loud enough for other parents to hear. "My mom said you should study at home so you don't contaminate the other kids with your ugliness." The silence that followed was deafening. Parents stopped talking, children stood still, everyone staring at us. Emma squeezed my hand so hard that I felt her fingernails dig into my skin. "My name is Lucas Andrade, and at 36 years old, I never imagined I would be standing in a schoolyard feeling the kind of anger that makes you question your own sanity. But as I watched that 8-year-old boy terrorize my daughter for the 10th time that month, something inside me snapped. Emma wasn't born with those scars. She got them when our house caught fire one December night when she was only 3 years old. The flames consumed everything we had built, including my wife, Amanda, who died trying to reach Emma in her bedroom. I managed to save my daughter, but burns covered 30% of her little body. 18 surgeries, 2 years of physical therapy, and countless therapy sessions later, Emma had become the bravest child I knew. Until she started attending Riverside Elementary School. Tyler Morrison had turned my daughter's school life into a daily nightmare. He convinced other children to avoid Emma, came up with cruel nicknames, and even went so far as to spill milk on the table where she was eating lunch, saying that monsters don't deserve clean food. "Mr. Andrade," the teacher's voice interrupted my thoughts. "We need to talk about Emma and Tyler. Again." Mrs. Patterson approached me with that tired expression I knew so well. It was the 4th meeting in 6 weeks. "Tyler is dealing with some complex family issues," she explained for the 1,000th time. "His father has a complicated history, and the family is going through a difficult time. Perhaps we can implement some more mediation strategies." Mediation strategies. As if pretty words could heal my daughter's broken soul. That night, after putting Emma to bed with yet another story about brave princesses and kind dragons, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. I sat down at my computer and began researching everything I could about the Morrison family. Address, professional history, public records. If the school wasn't going to protect my daughter, I would do it myself. What I found made me even more determined. Richard Morrison, Tyler's father, had a past that explained a lot about his son's behavior. Fired for drunkenness, fines for disturbing the peace, a history of domestic violence that resulted in divorce 2 years ago. But there was something else. Something that made my blood run cold when I read the details of the archived police report. Richard Morrison had been a firefighter. Not just any firefighter, he had worked in the department that responded to the fire at our house 5 years ago. My mind began to connect pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed. Why would an experienced firefighter have been fired right after that fire? Why had his life fallen apart at exactly the same time ours was falling apart? I closed my laptop and looked out the window of my office. Tomorrow would be Saturday. Tyler and his father would be home. It was time for a visit that would change everything. If you're enjoying this story of a father determined to protect his daughter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because what happened when I knocked on the Morrison family's door went far beyond anything I could have ever imagined. Saturday morning, 7 o'clock sharp. I parked my car 3 blocks from the Morrisons' house and walked slowly to the residence. The neighborhood was a decaying version of the American dream. Houses that were once the pride of working families now showed signs of neglect and despair. Richard Morrison's house was the worst of them all. Dirty windows, a lawn that hadn't seen a mower in months, a wooden fence that leaned dangerously toward the sidewalk. Empty beer cans littered the small front yard, and the sour smell of alcohol and cigarettes wafted even from outside. When I knocked on the door, I heard slow movements and muffled grumbling. My research had revealed that Richard Morrison woke up late on weekends, usually hungover from nights at the Shamrock Tavern, the nearest bar. The door creaked open, revealing a man who might once have been impressive. Richard Morrison was 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that still suggested physical strength, but his red eyes and rumpled clothes told a different story. He was a broken version of the man who had once run into fires, saving lives. "What do you want?" he grumbled, running his hand through his tousled hair. His breath was a toxic mixture of cheap alcohol and unfiltered cigarettes. "My name is Lucas Andrade," I replied calmly. "I'm the father of Emma, the girl your son Tyler has been tormenting at school." I saw something change in his eyes. It wasn't exactly surprise, more like resignation. As if he knew this moment would eventually come. "Oh shit," he whispered, rubbing his face with his hands. "Tyler told me about a girl with scars. He said he had fought with her a few times." Fought with her. As if terrorizing an 8-year-old was an argument between equals. "Mr. Morrison, your son didn't fight with my daughter. He has systematically tortured a child who survived a devastating fire. He calls her a monster. He says she should hide so she doesn't scare the other children. He's convinced the entire class to avoid her during lunch." Richard closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was a depth of pain there that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. "Do you want to come in?" he asked, stepping back from the door. "I think we need to talk properly about this." The inside of the house was even worse than the outside. Empty bottles covered every available surface. Piles of dirty clothes accumulated in the corners. The smell of mold and neglect was almost unbearable. Richard cleared a pile of unopened mail from an old chair and gestured for me to sit down. "Tyler is at his grandmother's house today," he explained, walking into the kitchen. "Coffee?" "No, thank you." He returned with a stained mug and sat down heavily on the sofa across from me. For a moment, he just drank his coffee and watched me with those eyes that had seen too much. "About your daughter," he began slowly. "Tyler told me she has burn scars. Is that from a fire?" My jaw clenched. 5 years ago. Our apartment on George Street. My wife died in the fire. Emma was 3 and suffered burns over 30% of her body. I watched Richard's reaction carefully. He stood completely still, the coffee mug halfway to his mouth. "George Street," he repeated, his voice just a whisper. "December 2018. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "Do you remember that fire?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, even though my heart was racing. Richard placed the mug on the coffee table with trembling hands. "Mr. Andrade, I need to tell you something. Something that will be difficult to hear." I waited. I was a firefighter at the time. I was part of the team that responded to that call. The silence that followed was charged with a tension I could almost touch. Finally, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but in a way I could never have predicted. "You were there," I said. It wasn't a question. I was there. And I. His voice faltered. "I failed." Richard stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. His hands were shaking visibly now, and I could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Mr. Andrade, that night changed my life forever. Not in the way you think, but," he paused and looked directly at me. "I couldn't save your wife." I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. "What do you mean?" When we arrived at the building, the second floor was already completely engulfed in flames. My captain determined that it was too dangerous to send anyone upstairs, but I heard screams. A child crying. "Emma." I disobeyed direct orders and went up the stairs. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was so thick I could barely see a meter in front of me. "I found your daughter first, in the room at the end of the hallway. She was conscious, but burning." Richard stopped walking and leaned against the wall, as if the memories were physically too heavy to carry while standing. "I got her out of there and handed her over to the medical team downstairs. Then I went back to look for your wife." "But the building was already collapsing," I whispered, remembering what the investigators had told me later. "Exactly. When I got to the master bedroom, part of the ceiling had collapsed. Your wife she was unconscious, trapped under a fallen beam. I tried to move her, but it was impossible to do it alone. I needed help, equipment." Richard ran his hands over his face, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. I radioed for backup, but the captain ordered me to leave immediately. He said the entire building was about to collapse. I had to make a choice, Mr. Andrade. Stay and die trying to save someone who might already be dead, or leave and live with the burden of having left her behind. The silence returned, heavier than before. "I chose to live," he whispered. "And every day since then, I've hated myself for it." I looked at this broken man in front of me, and for a moment, my anger turned into something more complex. Richard Morrison wasn't just the negligent father of a cruel bully. He was a man who carried the guilt of not saving my wife. But then I remembered Emma crying on my shoulder the night before, asking if she really was a monster. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice cold again. "Your guilt doesn't justify what Tyler is doing to my daughter." He nodded miserably. "I know. Tyler doesn't know about the fire. He only knows that I drink too much, that I lost my job, that his mother left us. He's angry at the world, and I haven't been a good father to help him deal with it." "No," I agreed. "You haven't." Richard looked at me in surprise. Perhaps he expected sympathy, understanding, immediate forgiveness for the tragic connection between our families. But I wasn't there to absolve him. "Does Tyler know my daughter survived a fire?" "No. I mean, he knows she has scars, but I never told him about my work as a firefighter. It's a part of my life I'd rather forget." An idea began to form in my mind. An idea that could solve Tyler's problem and perhaps give both broken men in this house a chance at redemption. Or destroy them completely. "Mr. Morrison, I think it's time for Tyler to learn some important truths about courage, about consequences, and about the true meaning of being a hero." Richard looked at me with confusion. "What do you mean?" I stood up, walking over to the dirty window overlooking the street. Outside, I saw a small bicycle leaning against the porch. "Tyler's bicycle. I mean that I'm going to tell Tyler exactly who your daughter is, and the role you played in saving her life. And then we'll see if he still thinks Emma is a monster." What Richard Morrison didn't know was that I had recorded our entire conversation on my cell phone. And what I planned to do with that information would go far beyond just teaching a bully about empathy. When I got home that Saturday afternoon, I found Emma on the couch watching cartoons, her little legs dangling in the air. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt even in the October heat, trying to hide the scars that Tyler had turned into a source of shame. "Hi, Daddy," she said without taking her eyes off the television. "How was your outing?" "It was enlightening, sweetheart," I replied, sitting down next to her. "Emma, do you remember anything about the fire? About who saved you?" She turned to me with those big, curious eyes. "Just a little. I remember a lot of smoke and heat. And someone picking me up, telling me everything was going to be okay." "Why?" I stroked her brown hair. "Just curious." But my mind was already processing the devastating implications of what Richard Morrison had confessed. This broken man wasn't just the negligent father of a bully. He was the only person alive who knew the intimate details of my wife's death. And now I had the entire conversation recorded on my cell phone. On Monday morning, I took Emma to school as usual. Tyler was in the playground with a group of friends, pointing at the other children and making cruel comments. When he saw Emma, his face lit up with that characteristic malice. "Look who's here," he shouted loud enough to get attention. "Frankenstein's girl. I bet she haunts your house, Mr. Andrade." The other kids laughed nervously. Emma squeezed my hand and lowered her head. "Tyler Morrison," I said, my voice cutting through the cold morning air. "Come here." The boy approached arrogantly, clearly not expecting to be confronted directly by an adult. "I want you to take a good look at my daughter's scars," I continued, ignoring the whispers of the other parents. "Take a good look and tell me what you see." Tyler hesitated, confused by my direct approach. I see ugly scars." "No," I replied calmly. "You see the marks of a survivor. You see proof that this girl faced something that would kill most adults and lived to tell the story. You see evidence of courage you will never understand." The playground had fallen completely silent now. Other parents stopped to listen. "And you know what else, Tyler? Your own father helped save her life. But you didn't know that, did you?" I saw the confusion cross the boy's face. "My dad's no hero. My dad's a drunk." Mrs. Patterson appeared quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the public confrontation. "Mr. Andrade, perhaps we can continue this conversation in private." "There's nothing private about publicly humiliating a child," I replied, still looking at Tyler. "Just as there's nothing private about allowing this to go on for weeks without any real consequences." That afternoon, after Emma went to my sister Karen's house to spend the night, I sat down in my office and began to devise a plan that would change everything. I called my lawyer, David Chun, a meticulous man who had helped me after the fire with insurance and liability issues. David, I need information on negligence lawsuits involving the fire department. Specifically, about a firefighter named Richard Morrison who was fired shortly after my house burned down. Lucas, are you okay? Why are you digging into this now? I've uncovered some disturbing information about that night. Information that could have significant legal implications. David was silent for a moment. I'll make some discreet inquiries. But Lucas, if you're thinking of reopening old wounds, make sure you're prepared for the consequences. While waiting for David's response, I began my own digital investigation. Richard Morrison had left an interesting online trail over the past 5 years. Newspaper articles about his dismissal from the fire department cited protocol violations and disobeying direct orders. There were also records of multiple arrests for public intoxication, disturbing the peace, and a domestic violence charge that was dropped when his ex-wife moved out of state with Tyler. But what really caught my attention was an article from an obscure blog about veterans and PTSD, where Richard had given an anonymous interview about survivors' guilt among firefighters. In the interview, he spoke vaguely about an impossible choice, and how saving one life sometimes means accepting that you can't save another. It was clearly about the fire at our house. On Wednesday, David called me back with information that made my blood boil. Lucas, I found some interesting documents in the department archives. Richard Morrison wasn't just fired for insubordination. There was an internal investigation into his actions that night. What kind of investigation? Apparently, some superiors questioned whether he followed proper protocol during the rescue. There were suspicions that he could have done more to save his wife, but the investigation was shelved when Morrison voluntarily resigned. I felt a cold anger spreading through my chest. So they knew there was something wrong with his actions. Not necessarily. The report suggests that Morrison made questionable decisions, but not necessarily criminal ones. Firefighters have to make difficult choices in emergency situations. David, I have a recording of Morrison admitting that he disobeyed direct orders that night. That he made choices based on his own judgment, not on established protocols. Total silence on the other end of the line. Lucas, did you record a conversation without the other party's consent? In our state, only one party needs to know about the recording. I knew. That changes everything. If Morrison really admitted to negligence or disobedience that resulted in Amanda's death, you may have grounds for a civil lawsuit. Possibly even criminal. That night, I organized all the documents, recordings, and evidence I had collected. But my plan went far beyond a simple lawsuit. Richard Morrison had allowed his son to torment a child he himself had saved. He had carried his guilt in silence, while Tyler repeated the same patterns of cruelty that had defined their lives. It was time for some painful truths to come to light. On Thursday morning, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to the local news channel, where I spoke with investigative reporter Sarah Kim about a story of public interest involving firefighter accountability and the lasting consequences of decisions made during emergencies. The second was to the school principal, Dr. Norris. Dr. Norris, on Monday afternoon, I will be bringing you some important information about Tyler Morrison and the bullying situation involving my daughter. Information that I believe the school, parents, and community need to know. Mr. Andrade, I appreciate your patience with our mediation process, but there will be no more mediation, I interrupted. There will be complete transparency about why this child acts the way he does, and how the responsible adults failed to protect all the children involved. I hung up the phone and looked out my office window. Outside, children played in a nearby park, their laughter echoing through the afternoon. Emma deserved to play like that, without fear, without shame for her scars. And Richard Morrison, who had carried his secrets and guilt for 5 years while allowing his son to perpetuate cruelty, was about to discover that some truths cannot remain buried forever. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just planning to expose his professional negligence. I was about to publicly reveal how a man who once risked his life to save children had failed so completely to protect his own family that he now raised little monsters instead of heroes. On Friday morning, I received a call that completely changed my original plan. It was Sarah Kim, the investigative reporter I had contacted. Mr. Andrade, I need to speak with you in person about Richard Morrison. I've uncovered some information that I think you'd like to know. We met at a discreet cafe in the city center. Sarah was a determined woman with sharp eyes that suggested years of investigating stories that other people would rather keep buried. "Your firefighter Richard Morrison has a more complex history than I imagined," she began, opening a folder full of documents. "He wasn't just fired for insubordination. There were 3 other families who filed informal complaints about his actions in emergencies in the 2 years prior to the fire at your house." I felt my heart race. What kind of complaints? Situations where families questioned whether Morrison did everything he could to save loved ones. There were never any formal investigations because there was no conclusive evidence of negligence, but there was a pattern. Sarah slid a photograph across the table. It was Richard Morrison in his firefighter's uniform, younger, more confident, posing with his team. Colleagues reported that Morrison had a tendency to make unilateral decisions during emergencies. Heroic at times, reckless at others. The problem is that when you save one life, no one questions the ones you didn't save. "Until now," I murmured. "Exactly. And there's more." After his dismissal, Morrison tried to apply to other fire departments in nearby cities. He was rejected by all of them. Not officially because of his record, but the recommendations were weak. Sarah closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Mr. Andrade, I have enough material for a full investigative report on firefighter accountability and systemic failures. But I need your recording to give credibility to the other accusations." It was exactly what I was hoping for. "You'll have the recording," I replied. "But I want the report to be live on Monday night. And I want it to include information about how Morrison's son is repeating his father's patterns of irresponsible behavior." That weekend, while Emma played at my sister's house, I finalized the last details of my plan. Richard Morrison had not only failed to save my wife, he had consistently failed in his responsibilities, and now he was failing as a father. I called Dr. Norris on Sunday night. "Dr. Norris, on Monday morning, the local media will be investigating issues related to Tyler Morrison's behavior and parental neglect. I suggest the school be prepared for comments." "Mr. Andrade, I don't understand. What kind of investigation?" "The kind that explains why a child becomes a bully when he grows up in a home where moral failure is normalized. Tyler didn't learn cruelty on his own. He learned it by watching his father." On Monday morning, I took Emma to school as usual. But this time, there was a camera crew waiting in the parking lot. Tyler was in the courtyard, acting with his usual arrogance, clearly unaware that his world was about to implode. "Daddy, why are there so many people with cameras?" Emma asked, squeezing my hand. "Because today, princess, the whole town is going to learn about real courage and real consequences." Sarah Kim approached with her cameraman. "Mr. Andrade, we're ready when you are." "Tyler," I shouted across the playground. "Come here. There are some people who would like to meet you." The boy approached curiously, clearly enjoying the attention. He had no idea he was walking straight into the center of a storm that would destroy everything he knew about his father. "Tyler, this is Sarah Kim from Channel 7 News. She's doing a story about heroic firefighters and the children they save." Tyler's eyes lit up. Finally, something that could make him interesting at school. "My dad was a firefighter," he said proudly to the camera. "Was he?" Sarah asked with a professional smile. "And do you know about any of the people he saved?" Tyler nodded, and I felt an almost imperceptible pang of guilt. "Almost. Well, Tyler, your dad saved a 3-year-old girl from a terrible fire 5 years ago. A little girl who grew up and now attends your school. Emma, come here." Emma approached hesitantly, her scars clearly visible under the camera lights. I saw the exact moment when Tyler made the connection. His face went pale, his eyes widened in horror. "Emma is the child your father saved," I continued calmly. "Her scars are proof of your father's courage. So tell me, Tyler, why do you call a fire survivor a monster? Why do you torture a child that your own father risked his life to save?" Tyler began to stammer, clearly panicking in front of the cameras and the devastating realization of what he had been doing. I didn't know. I didn't. Didn't know what?" I pressed. "Didn't know that your words hurt? Didn't know that calling someone a monster is cruel? Or didn't know that your father has a history of making questionable decisions that cost lives?" That's when I heard the roar of a diesel engine rapidly approaching. Richard Morrison had arrived. He jumped out of his pickup truck with the wild eyes of a man who knew his world was falling apart. Clearly, someone had called to warn him about the cameras at the school. "Get those cameras away from my family," he shouted, marching toward us. Sarah Kim strategically positioned herself between him and the cameras. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sarah Kim from Channel 7. We'd like to ask you some questions about your actions during the fire on George Street in December 2018. Richard stopped abruptly, as if he had hit an invisible wall. If you're following this story of justice and accountability, don't miss the next moment, because what Richard Morrison did in front of those cameras exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. "How did you find out about this?" he whispered, his eyes darting from me to Sarah, to the cameras, to Tyler, who stood there looking lost and scared. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah continued professionally, "we have recordings where you admit to disobeying direct orders on the night of the fire. We have statements from other firefighters questioning your decisions. And we have evidence of a pattern of behavior that raises serious questions about your suitability for emergency services." Richard looked at me with a mixture of anger and despair. "You recorded our conversation." "I did," I confirmed calmly. "Just as I documented 5 years of parental neglect that resulted in your son becoming a cruel bully. Tyler wasn't born bad, Mr. Morrison. He learned that failing to protect vulnerable people is acceptable by watching you." "Daddy," Tyler whispered, tugging at his father's sleeve. "Is it true? Did you really save Emma?" Richard looked at his son, then at Emma, then at me. I saw tears welling up in his eyes. "Tyler, But the damage was done. The truth had been exposed under the harsh light of the television cameras, and there was no turning back. The man who had spent 5 years trying to forget his failures would now face them publicly. And the son who had mirrored his father's irresponsibility would finally understand the real consequences of cruelty. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah continued relentlessly, "our investigation has revealed that you were fired from the fire department for a pattern of insubordination that put lives at risk. Do you deny these allegations?" Richard looked around desperately. Other parents had gathered, forming a tense circle. Children watched with wide eyes. Tyler clung to his father's shirt, clearly terrified by what was happening. That was a long time ago. I did the best I could that night." "The best you could?" My voice cut through the cold air. "I'm going to play back exactly what you told me last Saturday about your best decisions." I pressed play on my phone, and Richard's drunken voice echoed clearly across the silent courtyard. "I disobeyed direct orders and went upstairs. I found your daughter first. I got her out of there. Then I went back to look for your wife. I had to make a choice. Stay and die trying to save someone who might already be dead, or leave and live with the weight of having left her behind." The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Dr. Norris cover his mouth with his hands. Other parents exchanged shocked glances. Tyler let go of his father's shirt and recoiled, as if he had been physically struck. "Dad," he whispered, you let Emma's mother die." "Tyler, it wasn't like that," Richard began, but Sarah wouldn't let up. "Mr. Morrison, we have documentation from 3 other families who questioned your decisions during emergencies. We have internal reports suggesting a pattern of reckless behavior. And now we have your own recorded confession admitting that you prioritized your own safety over the fulfillment of your duty." Richard tried to take a step toward the cameras, but 2 school security guards discreetly positioned themselves between him and the film crew. "You don't understand," he shouted, completely losing control. "I saved the girl. I risked my life. If it weren't for me, she'd be dead." "If it weren't for you," I replied calmly, "my wife would still be alive." That's when I produced the second device I had prepared, a tablet with documents David had obtained through public records requests. "Sarah, I'd like you to see this. Reports from the chief investigator on the George Street fire. Specifically the section that states Amanda Walsh could have been saved if the firefighter in charge had followed standard protocol and waited for backup before attempting a solo rescue." Richard turned pale. "Those reports were sealed." "Not when there are matters of public interest involved." David Chun appeared behind me, clearly having arrived as planned. "And definitely not when there is evidence that you lied in your official statements about your actions that night." Tyler was crying now, not the frustrated tears of a spoiled child, but the devastating sobs of someone whose entire world was falling apart. "Emma," he turned to my daughter, who had stood silently by my side throughout the confrontation. I'm sorry. I didn't know my father. Tyler, Emma said softly, surprising us all with her maturity, you didn't know. But now you do. And now you can choose to be different from your father. The devastation on Richard's face was complete. His own son had just publicly rejected him, on camera, choosing the child he had tortured over the father who had failed to protect her. There's one last thing, I announced, holding a sealed envelope. Richard, you remember mentioning that other families had questioned your decisions? Well, I contacted all of them. I opened the envelope and took out a series of letters. The Peterson family, whose son died in a school fire in 2017. The Rodriguez family, who lost their grandmother in a house fire in 2018. The Chin family, no relation to my lawyer, who lost 2 children when you decided it was too dangerous to enter a smoke-filled basement. Richard was shaking his head violently. Those cases were investigated. I was cleared of any negligence. Cleared by a department that needed to protect its own reputation, David interjected. But now that we have your recorded confession admitting to a pattern of prioritizing your own safety over civilian lives, these families have legal grounds to reopen their cases. Sarah turned to the main camera. We're live from Riverside Elementary School, where shocking revelations about firefighter negligence are coming to light. Mr. Morrison, our viewers would like to know, how many people died because you chose your own safety over following protocols that exist to save lives? That's when Richard Morrison finally broke down completely. I tried, he shouted, falling to his knees on the cold asphalt. I tried to save everyone. You don't know what it's like to be inside those flames, to feel the heat melting your skin, to not be able to breathe. I did what I could. No, my voice echoed across the silent courtyard. You did what was safest for you. And now, 5 years later, your son is repeating your patterns, choosing to torment the vulnerable instead of protecting them. Tyler approached Emma and in front of the entire school, the entire media, the entire world watching, knelt in front of her. Emma, I'm just like my father. I hurt you because I was scared and angry. But I don't want to be like him. Can you teach me how to be truly brave? Emma looked at me, then at Tyler, then at her broken father on the floor. Being brave, she said with the wisdom that only trauma can teach a child, means protecting people, not hurting them. It means telling the truth even when it's hard. It means admitting when you're wrong and trying to be better. Richard Morrison lifted his eyes from the asphalt and looked directly at me. There was no more defensiveness, no more excuses. Just a broken man finally facing the full weight of his failures. Mr. Andrade, he whispered, how can I fix this? I crouched down to his level, aware that the cameras were capturing every moment of this final breakdown. You can't fix the deaths your choices caused, Richard. You can't bring my wife back. But you can make sure Tyler learns that there's a difference between survival and heroism, between fear and courage. What happened after that public confession would change not only our families, but the entire community, in ways even I hadn't anticipated in my most ambitious plans. 3 months after Richard Morrison's public exposure, our town had been completely transformed. Sarah Kim's investigative report triggered a complete overhaul of fire department protocols and reopened 5 shelved cases of negligence. Richard faced criminal charges for perjury and negligence in the performance of his duties. He lost his home, his job as a safety instructor, and faced civil lawsuits from 4 families. But the most devastating consequence was the loss of custody of Tyler. Daddy's going to rehab, Tyler explained to me as he and Emma built a Lego castle in our living room. He said he needs to learn how to be really brave before he can teach me. Emma stopped fitting the pieces together and looked at her friend. You don't have to wait for him to learn, Tyler. You're already being brave. It was true. Tyler had become Emma's fiercest protector at school. When other students made comments about her scars, he patiently explained about survival and real courage. He had transformed from a bully into a defender. The most surprising transformation, however, was my own. I discovered that true revenge was not in destroying Richard Morrison, but in using his downfall to build something better. I created the Amanda Walsh Foundation to support families of victims of negligent emergencies. The first donation came from an unexpected source, Richard Morrison, who transferred his entire firefighter pension to the foundation as part of his court settlement. "Mr. Andrade," he said during our last conversation before entering rehab, "I can't undo my choices. But I can make sure Tyler grows up knowing the difference between survival and heroism." 6 months later, Emma was on stage at school receiving the Student Courage Award. Her scars glowed under the lights, no longer marks of shame but symbols of strength. "Courage," she said into the microphone with the confidence of someone who has faced her worst pain, "is not about not being afraid. It's about choosing to protect others even when you're scared." Tyler applauded louder than anyone in the audience. I watched my daughter on that stage and thought of Amanda. She would have been proud not only of the survivor Emma had become, but of how we had turned our pain into purpose. Richard Morrison tried to break us by exposing our vulnerabilities. Instead, he taught us that our scars are not evidence of weakness, but proof that we have survived storms that could have destroyed us. In the end, Emma was right about courage. And Tyler learned that being different from his father meant choosing to protect rather than neglect, to heal rather than hurt. If this story about turning pain into purpose has touched you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about how true courage always triumphs over cowardice. Some battles are not won with revenge, but with the conscious choice to build a better world from the rubble of what was destroyed.